thank you to His Excellency Mr. Betkolia, member of the Majlis and Secretary General of the Assyrian Universal Alliance, for the invitation to speak tonight on the occasion of Assyria Day. The day embodies the resilience of the Assyrian people scattered around the world and your enduring attachment to the land of Assyria. It's a recent tradition born of indignation at the destruction of Iraq that has been underway for 14 years now. As the representative in Iran of Australia, two of the countries in which the Assyrian people have found safety and new lives, I'm honoured to say something about the Assyrian community of Australia. But first, indulge me while I rejoice in being among you. My grandfather was a suburban family doctor in Australia who loved reciting narrative verse. His favourite was Lord Byron's The Destruction of Sennacherib, which begins, as you may know, "The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold." So your ancestors featured strongly in the imagination of 20th century Australia. In Sunday school, I learnt about Jonah and his reluctance to save the people of Nineveh, preferring to be swallowed by a fish. But save them he did, and so you are here. In the galleries of the British Museum, as a schoolboy, I was awed by the Assyrian sculptures from Nimrud, Nineveh, Khorsabad and Balawat. And as a student at the University of Sydney, I studied Akkadian and learned to read cuneiform. Many of the texts we studied were oracles, how to read the future in the organs of sacrificed animals or in the stars. And I'm afraid that not a lot of the vocabulary has stuck with me. Similarly with Aramaic, the language of Jesus, which I learnt as part of biblical studies, largely so as to be able to read the book of the prophet Daniel, whose tomb my archaeologist wife Christine and I visited in Susa or Shush earlier this year. Which is a long-winded way of saying how delighted I am to find myself in the company of real Assyrians, the indigenous people of northern Mesopotamia. And on the first day of the month of Tammuz, the Akkadian god of regeneration, consort of Ishtar. So you represent at least 3,000 years, maybe 6,000 years, of cultural continuity. Your language and traditions have survived the downfall of about a dozen civilizations and the repeated tragedies of the modern history of the Middle East. That history has not come to an end, and just 2 days ago the Iraqi government announced the reconquest of most ancient Nineveh from the barbarians of so-called Islamic State or Daesh. Modern Assyrian identity is closely connected to the Church of the East, with its distinctive Christology that used to be called Nestorian, a term that I'm told is pejorative. It divided from Orthodoxy at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and appropriately for where we are tonight, the church was also in late antiquity called the Church of Persia, when it separated from the Patriarchate of Antioch, and the Catholicos of the East had his see at the Persian capital of Ctesiphon near modern Baghdad. The church's missionary activity extended to India and China. In the Dunhuang caves of Gansu province at the eastern end of the Silk Road, Sir Oral Stein found manuscripts of the Church of the East along with Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian and Manichaean documents of the first millennium of the Common Era. The modern Assyrian community also includes Syrian Orthodox Christians, a denomination that separated from Greek Orthodoxy after the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and whose patriarch I got to know quite well while serving in Damascus 24 years ago. And there are also Chaldean Catholics, members of the first Uniate Church to be established under its own patriarch in 1552, and one of whose priests I met in Mardan on the Syrian border when I was ambassador to Turkey 4 years ago. So I do realize that the Assyrian community, with its robust social institutions such as the Assyrian Universal Alliance and the Church of the East, are not exactly the same thing. There is something marvelous about the determination of a community to preserve its distinctiveness, and something very fine about the institutions of contemporary Iran that allow us to be together this evening and that respect your faith and facilitate your corporate activities For example, with the seat in the Majlis that Mr. Betkolia has earned through repeated and democratic election, and with free and regular worship in the many churches of the community in Iran. In light of what has happened to the community in Iraq recently, and I was chargé d'affaires in Baghdad in 2010 and had locally engaged Assyrian staff whose families and lives were being torn apart by terrorism and sectarian conflict, we must not take for granted the dignity granted to and exercised by the community here. And similarly in Australia. According to last year's census, there were 46,217 residents identifying themselves as Assyrian or Chaldean, most of them having immigrated from Iraq, Jordan and Syria. Only a quarter speak Aramaic or Syriac at home. They're concentrated, 75% of the total, in Fairfield in Sydney. And in Fairfield, 95% of the Iraqi-born population are Assyrian. Most Assyrian Australians, or their parents or grandparents, came as refugees, beginning with the 1958 revolution in Iraq, and with a major influx from the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Community institutions include churches, notably St. Hormizd Cathedral, schools, a range of civil society groups, radio broadcasts in Assyrian, and sporting teams, mainly soccer. I know of only one political figure from the community, former New South Wales parliamentarian Ninos Khoshaba. The Assyrian Australian best known in wider society is the Reverend Father Narsa Yohannis, who has spoken powerfully on national media about the plight of the Assyrians in Iraq and Syria. The Assyrian community has thrived in Australia as part of what Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull regularly describes as the most successful multicultural society in the world, with its success as freedom, democracy, the rule of law, inclusion and mutual respect. These are our answer to the disunity and tension fostered by the terrorism from which so many Australians, including much of the Assyrian community, have fled. Just within financial year 2015-16, the last year, 1,273 Assyrians and Chaldeans from Syria and 1,476 from Iraq were granted humanitarian visas to Australia. To put that in context, 26% of people in Australia were born overseas, and another quarter of the population had at least one parent who was born overseas. 21% of Australians speak a language other than English at home. We acknowledge different backgrounds and value them all. In a population of 24 million, 7 million are immigrants from more than 200 countries, and all are now as Australian as I am. We are not offended by people's choosing to maintain attachments to the various cultures of their respective life stories. And this has all been to the good. When the OECD recently republished its Better Life Index, Australia was the second best country in the world in which to live, after Norway. In expressing this pride in Australia, I should quickly circle back to my earlier remarks about the happy situation for the Assyrian community here in Iran. Community life is thriving in this ancient centre of its existence. My embassy does a great deal of work processing the humanitarian visa applications of people displaced from especially Afghanistan, but the migration pattern from Iran itself is almost all skilled or family reunion, and that is as it should be. There are Australian Defence Force personnel engaged right now in advising and assisting the Iraqi government in most immediately liberating Mosul. So it is entirely right that I should now congratulate you all on Assyrian National Day. I do not know what will happen next in the Iraqi and Syrian conflicts, or in global counter-terrorism, or even in the political developments in the Gulf. But I am truly confident that the Assyrians will continue as a people as the heirs to one of Earth's most resilient histories.